Professor Jaworski has published books, articles, and book chapters in a variety of prestigious venues. His most recent book, Structure and the Metaphysics of Mind, How Hylomorphism Solves the Mind-Body Problem, published in 2016 by Oxford University Press, won the 2017 Alpha Sigma Nu Book Award, an award given to scholars working on book projects at Jesuit institutions who are also Alpha Sigma Nu members. Professor Jaworski's work uses the ancient concept of hylomorphism, most notoriously defended by Aristotle, to address contemporary problems in conversations in metaphysics, philosophy of mind, and the philosophy of religion. On a personal note, Professor Jaworski was also my dissertation supervisor, so it's great to be able to welcome him to Loyola and to get the chance to catch up with him tonight. So let's give Dr. Jaworski a round of applause.
Thank you so much for coming, and many thanks to the conference advisors, the organizers of this excellent event for inviting me. It's a tremendous honor and just a real pleasure to be here. I'm originally from Chicago, and so it's a delight to be able to come back here and to discuss some philosophy with the good folks around here. Okay, so thanks. So there are a couple things that I want to accomplish in this talk. What I want to do is I want to contrast two competing worldviews. And I want to discuss the implications of these two views for our concepts of personhood and for our concept of spirituality. And this is just a quick representation of the worldviews. I am going to discuss these things in greater detail as the talk goes on. But one way of contrasting it, these worldviews, is to say that they kind of both reside within our heads, so to speak, in our intuitive ways of encountering the world. So on the one hand, when we encounter the things in our world, we don't encounter, so to speak, raw matter and energy. The people who deal with that kind of stuff are the people who, say, work with the Large Hadron Collider. For us, most of the material, most of the energy that we encounter is already organized or structured. Here a human being, there an oak tree, there a table, there a building, and so on. Not raw material, but material with a certain kind of organization. That's highly intuitive. Also highly intuitive are distinctions like the distinction between the mental and the physical. We are very comfortable distinguishing between, say, mental health on the one hand and physical health. Insurance companies love that distinction because they can sort of support treatment under one heading at a different rate from treatment under the other heading. It's a very intuitive kind of distinction to make. We distinguish between the mental aspects of athletic performance and the physical ones, or between, the athletic, mental aspects of musical performance and the physical aspects. It's a very intuitive distinction we make. Now, what I'm going to talk about, in part, is the fact that that distinction between the mental and the physical, and closely related distinctions between facts versus values, between freedom on the one hand and determinism on the other, that these are fairly recent philosophical inventions. They didn't always characterize the way that people looked at the natural world and the way that people looked at ourselves. And so what I'm going to try to bring out is an alternative worldview according to which these distinctions are not canonical. Because one of the things that I'm going to argue is that that worldview that's based on those dichotomies is responsible for generating mind-body problems, problems that have to do with fact and value, the problem of free will and determinism, and all sorts of problems that for the past few hundred years have interfered with our ability to understand what we are and how we fit into the natural world that's described by our best science. And I'm going to suggest that if we take on this alternative worldview, the one that actually has to do with matter and energy that's structured in various ways as we encounter it in our intuitive dealings, if we take on that worldview, we in fact are able to avoid those very difficult problems. Okay, let me talk a little bit about person just to emphasize what it is that I have in mind when I'm talking about it. So when it comes to persons, I just want to know, what is it that you refer to when you say I? So when I talk about myself, when I say I'm up here talking into a microphone, what am I referring to with that word I? When you refer to yourself, when you say I this or I that, what are you referring to when you say that? Now, there are a whole lot of different options on the table for understanding this. I'm just going to kind of dichotomize them. I'm going to sort of shrink all sorts of fine-grained distinctions that philosophers are inclined to make. I'm just going to group them into two broad categories. If we want to divvy them up into other smaller, tighter views later on, I'm happy to do that. But for right now, one kind of answer says that we're physical beings of a sort. For instance, human beings. Another kind of answer says we're not physical beings. We're non-physical beings of a certain sort. This is the kind of answer that's paradigmatically given by a theory called substance dualism. Now, when it comes to distinguishing us from other things, when it comes to understanding what we are and what makes us special or distinct, there are certain pressures that are applied to our ways of thinking about this that force us in a certain direction, either this direction or some version of this direction, and both of those options people find, for various reasons, unpalatable. Let me talk then a little bit about the worldview that generates these problems. This is the first of the two that I'm going to talk about. So I've just called it here the modern philosophical worldview. You can call it the post-Cartesian worldview. It's the worldview that crops up in the wake of the scientific revolution. The main architects of it are people like Descartes, Boyle, to some extent Galileo, David Hume. On this view, the physical universe is this vast, undifferentiated sea of matter and energy that is, or in principle will be, described by our best physics. Now, once you have a view of the world like that, vast, undifferentiated sea of matter and energy, the obvious question is what, if anything, makes us, inhabitants of the universe, special, different, distinctive? This question is proven, in some ways, very difficult to answer, especially when it comes to this kind of topic. I'm just going to call it human spirituality. It's just a label. You can call it anything you want. What it's a label for is what I'm most interested in. It's a sense that there is something about us that is unique and that is transcendent. This is a word that was used in here previously. In particular, it transcends our status as complex biological systems. It transcends our status as collections of particles or things that comprise collections of particles. It's a sense that there's something that is deeply profound and significant about our existence, something that isn't eclipsed by the vastness of cosmic space, that isn't eclipsed by the vastness of cosmic time, that even though we're just these tiny specks in a vast cosmic void, and even though each of our lives is just a tiny little flicker in the overall history of the universe, yet there is something that is special, something that's distinctive about us, something that really kind of would justify, so to speak, the existence of the entire universe, that it's beings like us that make the universe as a whole somehow special. So let's just stick a label on it, let's just call that human spirituality. And let's suppose that we wanted to give an account of human spirituality, of what that distinctive, special-making characteristic is. So one way you could try to do it is, we could just call it spirit embodied. It would say that that specialness, that distinctiveness, is something that resides in mundane physical materials of the sort that are described by our sciences. So the same kinds of materials that compose me also compose the chair and you and the oak tree and the rock. And whatever it is that makes us special exists in those materials somehow. We can contrast this with the notion of spirit disembodied. So the notion of spirit disembodied is that that thing that makes us special isn't something that exists in mundane physical materials. That precisely because the same materials compose you and I, and also the chair and the rock and the oak tree, therefore we can't be special. That whatever makes us special can't be something like that, something like the physical thing, can't exist in the mundane things. It's got to be something that's non-physical, some added special spiritual juice or something like this. So one of the things that I'm going to describe here is that this worldview forces us in the direction, or forces some people in the direction of wanting to endorse this kind of view. And one thing to mention about this kind of view, I won't discuss it in too much detail, but there are reasons to think that this view is deeply problematic, philosophically, theologically, and scientifically. Just to give you a naive intuition, one of the implications of this view is that the sciences can't tell us anything about us in particular. They can't certainly reveal anything that's special about us. And so it divests the sciences of any sort of contribution to an understanding of us as spiritual beings. Maybe some people like that result, but there is an alternative that's worth exploring, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, now, going back to that worldview, vast, undifferentiated sea of matter and energy. One of the implications of it is that it makes it very difficult to understand our distinctiveness, our specialness. Makes it very difficult to understand how we can be spiritual beings and yet also be inhabitants of the physical universe. So again, here's a depiction of the intuitive view that we might start with in our day-to-day lives. We've got people, and then we've got ordinary inanimate objects. And people, persons like us, we have certain kinds of distinctive capacities. We can think and feel and perceive and act, whereas something like the table can't. So we have this intuitive notion. Consider what happens to this intuitive notion once we start thinking it through philosophically and we take on this commitment to what I've just called the modern philosophical worldview. We have a vast, undifferentiated sea of matter and energy. And now suppose we want to know why this region of space-time has the power to think and feel and perceive and act, whereas this one doesn't. Insofar as the universe is a vast, undifferentiated sea of matter and energy, there's really nothing that you can look at there that's going to tell you. It just seems mysteriously that this zone has these powers to think and feel and perceive, whereas that one doesn't. And if you say, but why is that the case? Why is it that, say, this region right here can think, whereas this region right here can't? If the world is this undifferentiated sea of matter and energy, there isn't an obvious answer. The answers that are typically advanced fall into very predictable categories. So one of the answers, I'm just going to label this physicalism. Again, physicalism is a technical term in philosophy. If we want to talk about the varieties of physicalism, we can do that. Let's just sort of label it physicalism for the sake of easiness here. And that's the view that says, well, there really isn't anything distinctive about us. There really isn't anything special. Really, there isn't a distinctive individual right here. This is just a cloud of particles. And any powers that you might attribute to this individual, that's just really a shorthand way of trying to describe the complex relations among these particles. So let me give you an analogy. You get two dancers together to dance a tango. By dancing the tango together, they don't bring into existence this third individual. Anything that goes on in that zone where they are can be reduced to a description of what each of them is doing, of their own abilities to move themselves and to respond to their partner. Now, somebody might look at an organism and say, well, I mean, there's something different there. When these particles come together, unlike the tango dancers, they really do compose a new individual that has distinctive powers and capacities. But on this view, the physicalist view, that's not so. On the physicalist view, an organism is really no different from the dancing couple. Anything that's going on in this zone can be exhaustively accounted for just by talking about the individual activities of the particles that are here. There isn't a new thing here. No new individual, no new powers, no new capacities, no new activities. Whenever we talk about things like thinking and feeling and perceiving, we're really just talking about complex relations among particles. So there really isn't anything special about us. In fact, there's a certain sense in which really, like deep down, we don't exist. What exists are clouds of particles and their powers and capacities, and that's really just it. Another kind of response to the question that says, well, what is it that marks out this zone from this zone? Why can this one think and feel and perceive, whereas that one can't? Is a view I'm just going to call emergentism. And emergentism says, certain regions of space-time, they just coalesce and they sort of squirt out new powers, new activities, new properties that aren't had by the little bits of stuff all by themselves. And if you say, well, how does that happen? How is it that we start out with these little bits of things and then suddenly, magically, we just get thoughts and feelings and perceptions? And the answer that emergentists give is, we just do. Like that's just, like it just happens that way. That's just the way things are. As the emergentist Samuel Alexander once put it, that is something that we just have to accept with natural piety. We just have to look in the face of the universe. We can't ask why that's the case. We can't ask how it's the case. It's something that we just have to accept, not investigate. And so this gives up, one of the rubs of this is that it kind of gives up on the entire endeavor of something like philosophy, of something like science, which seeks understanding. Essentially what this view says is there are some things you just can't understand, you just got to accept them. Finally, you could deny that there are these distinctive capacities in the natural world altogether. So one kind of physicalist, an eliminative physicalist, says there are no such things as thoughts and feelings. Those are byproducts of a defective way of trying to describe and explain human behavior. Just as we tried to describe thermal phenomena by appeal to caloric or combustive phenomena by appeal to phlogiston, these were theoretical missteps, byproducts of defective attempts to explain the phenomena. Likewise, trying to explain what people do by appeal to things like beliefs and desires, likewise, theoretical misstep, mistake, error in our way of approaching things. It'd be like trying to explain the weather by appeal to the will of Zeus. There is no will of Zeus. When we get the true physical account of the weather, we realize it has nothing to do with Zeus. Likewise, according to eliminativists, when we get the true account of human behavior, we're going to finally see it has nothing to do with thoughts and feelings. We're going to recognize that those are just non-existent. Another way of pardon me, denying that these exist in the natural world is the way of substance dualists, the people we mentioned earlier. They don't deny that thoughts and feelings exist. They just deny that they exist in the natural world. Those, according to them, are properties of non-physical beings, us. We are non-physical ghostly entities. We can think and feel, but that's because we're not in the natural world. And so substance dualists and eliminativists actually have very similar views on the status of thought and feeling in the natural world. They both deny it, albeit for different reasons. And once we have a view of the world like this, a view of the world that says it's a vast, undifferentiated sea of matter and energy, those are pretty much our options for trying to explain what it is that makes us special. Trying to explain why it is, how it is, that you and I can think and feel and perceive, whereas the table or the chair can't. Our options become constrained, and they become constrained because of the general worldview that I described earlier. Physical world is a vast, undifferentiated sea of matter and energy. Now I'm going to talk about the alternative. The alternative worldview is hylomorphism. Fancy word, sounds cool. The concept behind it is very simple. It's that the world is composed of things that aren't just raw materials. There's another ingredient in the things that exist. It's the way those materials are organized or structured. That organization or structure is a basic ontological and explanatory principle. Again, fancy words. That is, structure makes a difference to what things exist, to what things there are. Moreover, structure makes a difference to what those things can do, to the powers or capacities they have. So there are a couple ways of bringing out the intuitive idea behind hylomorphism. Usually the one that people sort of really get is the one that I just call the squashing example. So Joe's a good sport. He has kindly volunteered for an experiment. It's a thought experiment. Thankfully, right? Joe's heard this many times. So what we're going to do is we're going to put Joe, you imagine this, we put Joe in a bag. It's a very strong bag because we want to make sure that nothing leaks out when we squash him with several tons of force. Now notice there is a change in the contents of the bag pre-squashing and post-squashing. Pre-squashing, the contents of the bag include one human being. Post-squashing, they include none. Pre-squashing, the contents of the bag can think and feel and perceive and act. Post-squashing, they can't. What made the difference, pre-squashing and post-squashing? It's not a difference in the materials. Those are exactly the same. That's why we use the really strong bag. We made sure nothing leaked out. The materials are the same, pre and post-squashing. The difference is in the way those materials were organized or structured. That organization or structure made the difference between there being a human before and not being one after. It also made the difference between the contents being able to think and feel and perceive and act before, but not after. And so on the hylomorphic view, structure, organization, form, whatever you want to call it, that is something that is just as real as materials are. Of course, it's a different thing from the materials. You can't see the structure in the way that you can see the materials, but nevertheless, it's there, and that made a difference to there being a human versus not, and to having the capacities to think and feel and perceive versus not. And so that's the basic hylomorphic idea. The universe, then, is not a vast, undifferentiated sea of matter and energy. The universe has that matter and energy, but it is punctuated here and there with these pockets of organized stability and change. Paradigmatically, organisms. Here a human, there an oak tree, there a dog. Those materials organized or structured in very particular ways that make those materials compose, on the one hand, a human, on the other hand, an oak tree, on the other hand, a dog. So that's one way of getting at the hylomorphic worldview. Another way of getting at it is by appeals to structure or organization in the actual sciences, paradigmatically, biology. So, this is a quote. It's taken from a very popular college-level biology textbook. So these are working biologists. And I mean, I have another presentation where I've got, and in the book there are like, a lot of quotes to this effect. But this is one that's simple and intuitive. What I've done here is I've highlighted all the references to things, the notion of organization or structure. Again, what I want to emphasize about this is these aren't hylomorphists who are writing the book. They've probably never even heard of hylomorphism. These are just working biologists who are doing their best to describe the phenomena that they study. And yet, in the process of doing that, they invoke a notion of organization that's very much like the notion of hylomorphic form or structure. So, life is highly organized into a hierarchy of structural levels. Biological order exists at all levels. Atoms are ordered into the complex biological molecules. Many of the molecules of life are arranged into minute structures called organelles, which are in turn the components of cells. Cells are in turn subunits of organisms. The organism we recognize as an animal or plant is not a random collection of individual cells, but a multicellular cooperative. With each step upward in the hierarchy of biological order, novel properties emerge that were not present at simpler levels of organization. A molecule such as a protein has attributes not exhibited by any of its component atoms, and a cell is certainly much more than a bag of molecules. If the intricate organization of the human brain is disrupted by a head injury, that organ will cease to function properly. And an organism is a living whole greater than the sum of its parts. We cannot fully explain a higher level of order by breaking it down into its parts. Now, here are the things that I want to bring out. This notion of organization or order or arrangement or whatever term they're using plays exactly the kinds of roles that I've described hylomorphic form playing. So it's an ontological principle. It makes a difference to there being a cell as opposed to just a bag of molecules, or to there being organisms or organs as opposed to just the smaller level bits of stuff. Likewise, it's not just an ontological principle, it's an explanatory principle. It makes a difference to what these things can do. If you disrupt the organization of the brain, it's not going to be able to do the thing that it normally does. Its capacity to operate in that way depends on the organization or structure. So again, structure is here being invoked to explain biological phenomena, and by invoking it, that notion of organization is playing ontological work and explanatory work. It is the notion of hylomorphic form. Here's another quote from the biologist Ernst Mayr. All biologists are thoroughgoing materialists in the sense that they recognize no supernatural or immaterial forces, but only such that are physical-chemical. The modern biologist rejects in any form whatsoever the notion that a vital force exists in living organisms which does not obey the laws of physics and chemistry. All processes in organisms strictly obey these physical laws. But modern biologists do not accept the naive mechanistic explanation of the 17th century and disagree with the statement that animals are nothing but machines. Where organisms differ from inanimate matter is in the organization of their systems. Organisms have many characteristics that are without parallel in the world of inanimate objects. The explanatory equipment of the physical sciences is insufficient to explain complex living systems. Why is it inadequate, insufficient for that task? Because of the organization that's involved. Now, when it comes to characterizing this worldview, again, in contrast to the other, the modern philosophical worldview says that the physical universe that's around us is an undifferentiated sea of matter and energy. We might choose to describe it in various ways because we've evolved perceptual capacities to focus on certain clouds of particles as opposed to others, and our concepts tend to follow our percepts, and so we have these ways of talking that tend to divide clumps of particles into things that we call dogs and trees and people and so on. But really, these are just conventional distinctions. Deep down in reality, the reality that's revealed by physics, we see that it really just is these clouds of particles that are there. And the natural world then is just a vast, undifferentiated sea of those particles. The hylomorphic worldview says, no, it's not that we're not seeing the particles. It's not that we're not seeing matter and energy. But the thing is, though, we're seeing something else that is there. And that is the way that matter and energy gets organized or structured. The way physics operates is by trying to ignore structure in order that it might isolate material by itself. And it's hard to do that because so much of the material that we encounter in our day-to-day lives is organized or structured. It took, humans, 100,000 years to develop the methods of the natural sciences. And it took them several hundred years more to develop things like Large Hadron Colliders, which would enable us to isolate materials independent of various ways of structuring. It's very hard to get raw natural material. The materials that we encounter tend to be organized or structured in various ways. And hylomorphists say that organization or structure is something that is just as real as raw materials themselves. And it is something that's been ignored for the past few hundred years for reasons that I'll actually explain in a little bit. But first things first, let's get back to the hylomorphic worldview and say a little more about it. So again, remember what the world looks like without hylomorphic structure. The worldview that says, yeah, it's just vast, undifferentiated sea of matter and energy. We see that there's a problem trying to explain how we have the capacities we have in such a universe. What distinguishes us from the table or the chair or the rock? But think again about the intuitive worldview that makes these intuitive distinctions. The hylomorphist says, you know what? We can make perfect sense out of our intuitive, pre-scientific, pre-philosophical intuitions about this, because it says, in point of fact, this sea of matter and energy is not undifferentiated through and through. Rather, here and there, it is punctuated with organized pockets of stability and change. Here, for instance, a human who has the right kind of organization, and that organization or structure confers on that individual distinctive powers. Remember, structure is an explanatory principle. It concerns what things can do. Get an individual with the right kind of structure, and you have an individual who has distinctive powers, including the powers to think and feel and perceive and act. And so hylomorphists say, we're just shoring up our intuitive view of things. Our intuitive view of things is that we encounter matter and energy that's worked up into certain cohesive wholes. Guess what? We can explain why. Structure is something real. And structure is something that confers distinctive capacities on things, including the capacities to think and feel and perceive. Since this thing doesn't have the right kind of organization or structure, it doesn't have those capacities. We have a very easy way of understanding how thought, feeling, perception, and action can exist in the natural world. The natural world is not what that modern philosophical worldview says it is. It's not undifferentiated. The natural world includes organization or structure, something that is just as real as materials. So when it comes to that notion of structure, there are ways of summing up the theoretical roles that that plays. This is one way of giving definitions. Definitions, these are operational definitions, where you define a term by explaining what it does within the theoretical framework as a whole, and then applying it to specific examples. So I've summarized these roles using 3 slogans. Structure matters, according to the Hylomorphist. Structure makes a difference, and structure counts. What do these mean? Well, again, structure is an ontological principle. It concerns what things there are. It's an explanatory principle. It concerns what things can do, the distinctive powers they have. And finally, structure counts. It explains the unity of composite wholes. So you look at, a cloud of particles, or you look at just these, medium-sized objects around us, and you might say, what does it take for many things to compose one thing? So these 2 chairs, could we sort of get these things together so that they compose a unique whole in their own right? Or are they forever going to be 2 things? What would it take to make these things into a whole? Would we have to glue them together? Would we have to tie them? Would we have to reposition them? The Hylomorphist answers this question by saying that what makes many things compose one thing is structure or form. Structure is a principle of unity. It's what explains why many things compose one thing. And so whenever we have one unified whole, we have an organization or structure that has brought together and unified diverse materials that compose that whole. That's what it means to say structure counts. Now, another way of bringing out this notion is by appeal to homeostasis, the self-maintaining activity of organisms. So there are some young philosophers of biology who are doing great work explaining how a hylomorphic notion of structure plays itself out in actual biological work, talking about how various genes get turned on and off in ontogeny. Rather than talking about those kinds of details, because that would be like a talk in its own right, I'm going to use a very simple example, a toy example. It's going to be based on Aristotle's picture of things, and something that Aristotle says in On the Soul. So for Aristotle, the basic materials in his physics are earth, air, fire, and water. We know that those aren't the real physical materials that are like most fundamental, but let's just pretend that that's so. It's again a toy example to illustrate this idea. So Aristotle says that living things like us, we're composed of those materials. We're composed of earth, air, fire, and water. We're composed of the fundamental physical materials, same as rocks and trees and everything else. Now, what he says is this: Earth, here's the way Earth operates. Earth always goes down to the center of the universe in Aristotle's physics. Fire, on the other hand, always goes up. Now, if humans were composed only of earth, then we would just collapse into a heap of earthy rubble. So clearly, we're not composed of earth alone. We're also composed of fire, which counteracts that tendency because it goes up. The thing is, though, says Aristotle, if that were the whole story, then living wholes would be torn apart. You get the earth together, you get the fire together, mix them up, and you know what? The fire is going to go up and the earth is going to go down. They're going to separate themselves, and so a living whole actually wouldn't last. It would get torn apart instantaneously as these things resolve themselves in different directions. But Aristotle says, that's not what happens. If we were to sort of look at an organism, if we could like zoom in like with a microscope, what we would see is this. We would say, oh, here's a bit of earth, and it's traveling downward. It's going to go all the way down. But no, suddenly its downward trajectory is counteracted by some fire, which is going upward. And we think, oh, well, the fire is just going to keep on going to the extremities of the universe. But no, some air gets in there and moves the fire, which is quenched by some water. And you sort of look at this and you're like, wow, it's like magic. It's almost as if, something is like at each moment intervening to make a change in the natural trajectories of the earth, air, fire, and water to maintain this stable whole. But Aristotle argues, it's not magic, and it's not chance, because magic doesn't exist in the natural world, and chance doesn't explain regularities, and yet this is ongoing in this system. Instead, to explain what's going on, we have to talk about something else. What we have to do is talk about what he calls soul, which is just the form, the structure, the organization of a living thing. And so when we look at this system, we're saying we have a unified whole here. It is an organism. And one of the things that this organism does is it proportions and directs and regulates the earth, air, fire, and water that compose it. And that is its most basic activity. It is the thing that it does that enables it to persist throughout its entire existence. It's what enables it to exist over time. That is its most fundamental activity, the one that he calls soul. So again, there are some philosophers of biology who are actually showing how you can work this out, how you sort of invoke the same principle to explain things in human development. You look at certain kinds of cells, the ways that they change in development, and they say, well, look, clearly you can't appeal to the little cells by themselves. There's instead some overarching principle that's responsible for explaining why these cells turn on and off at just these times in just these ways. And it's the same basic principle. You have an organism, which is a unified whole that is engaged in regulating the individual things and how they operate in order to hold itself together, to maintain itself over against the forces of dissolution, entropy. So that's another way of bringing out this basic notion. So, what are hylomorphic structures? You can call them activities, powers, capacities to do things. They're ones that we are essentially and continuously engaged in. We're essentially and continuously engaged in organizing the material that composes us. Every time you inhale, you take in oxygen atoms, you catch them up into your metabolic process, you make them parts of yourself for a while. You exhale those same particles in carbon dioxide molecules when they cease to be parts of you. This ongoing structuring activity is something that explains our persistence through time. And importantly, it has a solid empirical foundation. This is something that comes right out of our biology. I'll return to that point later because the claim that the hylomorphic worldview is false stems from the claim that it was falsified during the scientific revolution. But we'll get back to that later. Now, the kind of organization or form or structure that I've been talking about so far is what we might just call like an individual-making form or structure. It's what makes an individual, such as you and I, the kind of thing that we are. Medieval hylomorphists call these things substantial forms, but that term contemporary philosophers have no idea what to make of it. So individual-making structure, much simpler. On this view, though, it's not just individuals that have forms or structures. It's not just individuals that are unified wholes. It's also their activities. So if you think about an activity, a simple activity, think about something like, talking, walking, jumping, throwing a baseball. Anytime you engage in an activity of that sort, you are having your parts operate in a certain way, not in any sort of random way. When you throw a baseball, your limb isn't moving at random. Instead, you are imposing a certain kind of coordination on the way that your limbs, that your muscles and nerves are operating. You coordinate them in this specific way. You get the muscles and the nerves to fire in that way. That coordination that you impose on your parts, that is another species of form or structure. It's another way in which you can compose a whole, in this case, an activity, out of simpler things, sub-activities performed by your muscles and nerves. And so the hylomorphist says it's not just the activity of imposing your biological order on the materials that you're taking in, it's also a matter of imposing an order on the way that your parts do their jobs, on the way that your limbs move, for instance, or that your neurons fire. That's involved in our activities. Activity also is a case of hylomorphic structuring, a way in which we are ordering how things go in the world. Parts of ourselves in particular, and maybe in some cases surrounding things like the baseball or the pen. So these activity-making structures, they confer unity on diverse events in just the way that individual-making structures confer unity on physical materials. For me to engage in an act of talking is for me to operate my parts talking-wise. For me to throw a baseball is for me to operate my parts throwing a baseball wise. And likewise, for me to think or feel or perceive or act is for me to impose a certain kind of order or coordination on the way my parts operate. It is to coordinate their operation thinking-wise, feeling-wise, perceiving-wise. Thinking, feeling, perceiving, intentionally acting, in other words, are just structured activities of another sort. Now, if that's the case, notice the implications for the question of how it is that thinking, feeling, and acting can exist in the natural world. If structure is something real, if it exists completely unproblematically in the natural world in just the way materials do, and thinking, feeling, and perceiving are just structured occurrences of a certain sort, then there's no question how thinking, feeling, perceiving, and acting can exist in the natural world. Their existence in the natural world is no more mysterious than the existence of structure is. And on the hylomorphic view, that's not mysterious at all. That's just part of the way the natural world is. So, implications of this view. My powers are essentially embodied in the parts that I have. I can't throw a baseball apart from these parts disposed and operated in a very specific way. Likewise, I can't think or feel or perceive or act with very specific parts disposed and operated in a very specific way. I need to have those parts with the right kind of structure, with the right kind of order, with the right kind of coordination, because that just is what those activities are. So on this view, each of us is a unified yet complex whole. So complex, in fact, that the only way that we can understand what we are and what we can do is by using a plurality of methods. Some of them farmed out to this science, some of them farmed out to that science, some of them not farmed out to any science in particular, but just our intuitive ways of interacting with others in the environment. All of them get at different kinds of things that we do and that we can do. So the sciences, for their part, can help reveal which parts of ourselves are involved in those activities and what kinds of organization are necessary for us to engage in those activities. What kind of organization is necessary for those activities to get composed? Physics, moreover, can't give us the exhaustive description and explanation about ourselves in the way that physicalist story would have it. Why not? Well, because physics operates by ignoring organization or structure. Its goal is to try to find the materials, the raw materials, that can be structured in any way whatsoever. That's why you don't have a chapter in the physics textbook on living things specifically, because the physics textbook is concerned with describing the physical materials, whether they're in a living thing or a non-living one. Physics operates by ignoring structure. And so it doesn't explain the whole of us. It can't, possibly, because there's more to us than just the materials. There's also the organization or structure that's distinctive of us, that makes us the kinds of things that we are. Other sciences deal with other kinds of structures: biology, psychology, economics, social sciences of various sorts. And each of those disciplines has its own autonomous methods, because to study different kinds of structuring, you need different kinds of methods, and that's preserved by the account of structure. When it comes to, then, the other views that we had talked about, substance dualism, physicalism, emergentism, hylomorphists say, well, look, we've just given an account according to which thinking and feeling and perceiving and acting fit unproblematically into the natural world. Those other views make certain kinds of basic mistakes that are motivated by that alternative worldview, the view that says undifferentiated sea of matter and energy. So, for instance, substance dualists are right in recognizing human distinctiveness, human specialness. They're wrong, though, in supposing that to account for that we need to give up our status as physical beings. If they had a notion of hylomorphic structure, they would be able to recognize that you can accommodate that notion unproblematically within a physical universe. It's only because they have a different view of the natural world, one that doesn't have a notion of hylomorphic structure, that they think the only way of preserving what makes us special is by placing us outside the natural world and making us non-physical ghosts. Emergentists are also right in recognizing what makes us distinctive or special. What they get wrong is giving up the project of trying to understand what that consists in. They sort of make it completely mysterious. They say that you can't explain it at all. But as I've just described, hylomorphists say no. In fact, we can not only describe, we can understand it more fully. And in fact, the sciences can help us understand it more fully in their own distinctive ways. Physicalists, finally, they make the mistake of misunderstanding at a basic level what physics is doing. Again, physics operates by ignoring the various ways that things get organized or structured and trying to discover and discern the raw materials that can get structured in any way whatsoever. The mistake of physicalists who want to say that everything can be described and explained exhaustively by physics is mistaking this very limited goal of understanding one thing, the raw materials, for the unlimited goal of understanding everything. That's their mistake. It's a basic one, a misunderstanding of the nature of physical science. Now, seeing how the view accommodates this stuff, how it's unproblematically incorporates thought, feeling, and action into the natural world, you might wonder, well, gosh, why isn't everybody a hylomorphist? It seems to solve all these problems, and I've described the way it solves the live mind and body problems in detail elsewhere. But why isn't everybody a hylomorphist? It's been a marginalized view for several hundred years. So it's a sort of interesting story. Aristotle was the one who first articulated this view, and of course, his ideas were enormously influential for over 1,000 years. That changed with the scientific revolution, because the revolution showed that many of Aristotle's views, the ones that we would now call his empirical views, his actual science, his physics, his biology, and so on, those views were false. The thing is, though, interesting twist in the story. We are very comfortable these days drawing this distinction between science and philosophy. But this distinction didn't get firmly entrenched in people's minds until the 19th century. The term scientist wasn't even coined until 1838. Now, of course, prior to 1838, people were doing what we would now call science, but they weren't called scientists. They were instead called natural philosophers. And what they were doing was called natural philosophy. And the thing about natural philosophy is that it encompassed not just the stuff that we would call science, but it also encompassed a whole lot of stuff that we would call the metaphysics of nature, or the philosophy of nature. So in this one box, you had both science and philosophy, just sort of thrown together without any clear distinction between them. And so when it came to Aristotle's natural philosophy comprised both things that we would call Aristotle's science and also things that we would call Aristotle's metaphysics of nature. And so when leaders of the scientific revolution took aim at Aristotle's natural philosophy, for the most part, their target was what we would call just the scientific elements of Aristotle's natural philosophy. But since they didn't have that distinction clearly in mind, they blew up the whole thing. Now, in place of Aristotle's science, we got modern science, and we're very, very happy about that. No joke about that. In place of Aristotle's philosophy, we got modern philosophy, that modern philosophical worldview. And about that, we feel much more ambivalent. Why? Well, because it is a philosophy that is based on dichotomies: mental versus physical, mind versus body, freedom versus determinism, fact versus value. Why is it based on these dichotomies? Well, because one term in each of those dichotomies is based on that view of the natural world, vast, undifferentiated sea of matter and energy. That's our physical, that's our body, that's our determinism, that's our fact. And it is split from our ordinary ways of conceiving things. A way of conceiving things in terms of minds, in terms of thoughts, mental states, in terms of free will and decision and choice and moral responsibility, in terms of things that we value, what's good or bad or right or wrong. And the problems of modern philosophy, mind-body problems, problems with fact-value dichotomy, free will and determinism, all stem from these dichotomies, which are motivated by that modern philosophical worldview. So that's how we got to this point, and that's why things like the distinction between the mental and the physical seems so natural to us. Not necessarily because that distinction is in the book of nature as it comes off the press. That's what a lot of people think. But really, that distinction, the mental versus physical one, free will versus determinism, these are cultural artifacts that came into place in the wake of the scientific revolution because at the time philosophers were most concerned, natural philosophers were most concerned with moving ahead on the projects that we would now call science. And they couldn't afford to think through the implications for what we would now call the metaphysics of nature. So, we've got on the one hand Aristotle's view, and on the other hand, the kind of worldview that we get that I've called the modern philosophical worldview, of which Descartes and Hume are the chief architects. What I'm suggesting is we do well to distance ourselves from the kind of view that they've described and to explore the possibilities of the hylomorphic one because it pays dividends. Getting back to the theme of spirituality, one of the things that the worldview enables us to do is accommodate a notion of spirituality within the physical universe. Because if that is one of these things that has to do with us as psychophysical moral wholes, if we are in fact integrated beings who are at once physical, biological, mental, moral, and spiritual, and we just divvy things up in these ways based on the methods that we have of trying to understand what we are, then just as there's no problem understanding how thinking, feeling, and acting exist in the natural world, there's also no difficulty understanding how human spirituality can exist in the natural world. Thank you.